Hi everyone, welcome to another of our devotions. We're going to turn to Psalm number 4, and Psalm 4 is entitled An Evening Prayer. Again, it's a prayer of David. It probably was written in the same time frame as Psalm 3. In other words, the circumstances that David was facing when he wrote Psalm 4 were very much the same as when he wrote Psalm 3. The opening verse of this psalm is what I want us to focus on, and it's rich in content, and quiet reflection leads us to identify three things that are worthy of note. First of all, here we find David reflecting upon God's character. The opening words in the NIV translation are, "Answer me when I call to you, my righteous God." The ESV and the New King James Version translate it, "God of my righteousness." It's always good whenever we come to God in prayer to begin with God Himself. And I think that's what David's doing here when he speaks about God, my righteous God. He is focusing his thoughts on the one to whom he's coming. Now, he's in all sorts of trouble. He has enemies that are keen to seek out his life and to destroy him. David is feeling distressed, and yet, as he comes to God, he takes time to focus his thoughts on the character of the one he is approaching. And a particular characteristic that he focuses on is God's righteousness. He knows God will always act righteously, and as such, he will never ultimately allow evil to triumph over good. David is God's servant, and he's the object of wicked men's evil schemings, and the distress that he's experiencing is because of their sin. They want to get rid of him. David's comfort comes from a knowledge that God is righteous. He will not allow such wickedness to prevail and to triumph. In fact, he believes that he will ultimately triumph over his enemies because of the God that he worships. The King James translation that I mentioned and the ESV translation seems to allow for, and even maybe prefer, the idea that David is not only thinking about God being righteous, but he's also convinced of his own righteousness. He speaks of my righteousness. Uh, his righteousness in the sense that all this is happening to him even though he has not done anything wrong. He hasn't done anything to deserve this, so to speak. He, as far as he's aware, is blameless in all that is happening. And so he believes that God will work things out to show this to be the case. He believes that God will vindicate David, whose own righteousness is rooted in and comes from God. Before moving on, friends, let me say to you, don't be surprised if people turn on you and if they seek to harm you, if they say all kinds of evil against you. Even if you are blameless and done nothing wrong, even if you have sought to sincerely live righteously, you will find there will be some people who will nevertheless be out to attack you, even in the church. Many Christians, many pastors have found this to be the case. If that happens, let your confidence be in your knowledge of God's righteousness. He will not let evil triumph. But as well as seeing in this first verse David reflecting on God's character, we also see David remembering God's mercies. He says, "You have relieved me in my distress." And the important thing to note here is that David is thinking of relief that God has brought to him in the past. The verb here is in the past tense. David had in the past called out to God, and God had heard him and answered him and had brought him relief. And that being the case, David now takes encouragement from God's dealings with him in the past. The picture that David draws here is that of someone being in a tight place and things are getting tighter. It's nearly like being in one of those situations where the walls begin to close in upon a person and it seems as if you're going to be pressed and pressed and pressed. Well, the picture is God lifting David out of that narrow place in which he's being pressed and bringing him into circumstances where there is great space and great liberty. God's mercies in the past. It gave David confidence for the present and for the future. It gave him a great incentive to pray. It stimulated his faith. And God's dealings with us in the past do the same. They give us confidence for the present and the future. They give us great incentives to prayer and they stimulate our faith. And then the last thing we see in this first verse is a request for God's help. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. David has confidence to ask God to hear him now and to show him grace in these present difficulties, just as he has done in the past. When he asks God to be gracious to me, effectively what he's saying is, Lord, I need your help. Give me your help to deal with the present difficulties I'm facing. And isn't that what we need, brethren? We need God's grace. We need God coming to us, ministering to us, helping us in our various and ever-changing circumstances in life. This psalm tells us that because of who God is, because of what God has done for us in the past, we can confidently cry out to God for help, for grace, knowing that our God will hear us. May these thoughts be a comfort and a help to you as you go into the day. Every blessing.